If you haven't seen the Dune Part 3 trailer yet, I mean, what are you even doing watching this video? You need to see it because it's perhaps the most Dune trailer that they could have made for the movie. It's equal parts understandable, confusing, violent and calculating, loyal and treacherous, and pretty much everything else you can think of. It showcases the power of prophecy, the consequences of religious fanaticism, the endless burden of kingship, but if you don't look at it closely enough, you might miss out on a few details. But don't worry, that's why we're here and we've got you covered. Here are 20 things you may have missed in the Dune Part 3 official trailer explained. Immediate aftermath of Paul's victory. It looks like Dune Part 3 is going to pick up right after the ending of Part 2, because there's a shot at the minute 50-second mark where we see everyone bowing down to both Paul and Irulan. Paul has long hair here, and Irulan is still dressed in the gown that we last saw her in. You'll notice that the interiors of this room they're standing in don't look like the throne room at Arrakeen. It's a cavernous vault, and Paul is standing in the middle of the room with Irulan opposite him. This wasn't how they were positioned at the end of Dune Part 2, but it does make sense that they'd gather in such fashion because Irulan is going to become Paul's queen in Dune Part 3. He's going to marry her to legitimize his claim to the Golden Lion throne, and this could be like an acknowledgement ceremony for the same. It also looks like the film will feature massive time skips. Paul's rocking two different hairstyles in the trailer, his trademark long hair and a new shaved look that gives him a more sinister appearance. We're guessing this movie will pick up right after the events of Dune 2, showing us a bit of Paul's involvement in the Holy War's frontline activities, considering we see Paul fighting with his Fedaykin, and then moving on to at least a decade and a half down the line, maybe even 2 decades. And this shot isn't the only thing that will build upon the questions left unanswered by Dune Part 2. Paul meets Chani after she leaves. The first shot of the trailer sees Paul walking into a Fremen sietch and meeting Chani. It's clear from their body language that there's some tension between them, and Chani's dialogue pretty much confirms that. The first thing she does is push him and scream that she trusted him. Paul told Chani that Arrakis was his home, that the Fremen were his people, that he would never take power in his own name, and that he loved her enough to honor that promise. But then he broke it, and Chani left, which is something she didn't do in the books. In the books, Jessica told her that as Paul's concubine, she'd be a queen in truth, while Irulan would be the queen in name, and that seemed to be the extent of her role. Chani's been given a lot more agency in the Villeneuve films, and her abandoning Paul was a real event in this timeline. We can say that because both Paul and Jessica saw her leave right after they defeated the Emperor, so it wasn't some sort of dream reality sequence. In fact, there's another thing that happens in the trailer that we'll talk about in a bit that suggests the same, so stick around to the end to find out how this might play out in the movie. But here's where the confusion begins, because as Chani is chastising Paul, we're getting shots of her embracing him spliced into the conversation, creating a disorienting reality. This is where we talk about our first major theory for Dune 3, which is the blue scarf timeline. As Chani unloads on Paul, we get shots of her cozying up to him, her with him in a still tent with a huge belly, and then with a couple of children out on the sands. In most of these shots, a blue scarf is prominently visible, and this scarf seems to be a binding object between her and Paul. It's representative of their love and connection because the scenes in which it's featured, they're intimate with one another. One of them is an almost kissing scene, one of them is experiencing the joy of parenthood before the child's birth, and the third is her playing with those aforementioned children. So, how did this happen? Did Paul just convince Chani to come back with him? There's another shot in the trailer where he and Chani embrace in the same outfits that they're arguing in earlier, so there's a chance that Paul uses some of that lisan al-Gaib on her and brings her back to him. But there's another possibility, and that's that Chani and Paul's pregnancy storyline could be a hallucination, with the blue scarf being a sign that this is an alternate timeline. Why do we say that? Well, we've seen Paul experiencing alternate timelines in the past, like the one where Jameis was his friend and the one where Chani kills him. But now, he's taken the water of life, and his prescience is clearer, so perhaps he can view timelines sequentially instead of witnessing bits and pieces of them. We say this because the scarf and Chani's presence in at least one of those shots isn't supposed to happen, and hopefully that'll explain our argument about the timey-wimey nature of Dune 3's narrative as well. Leto and Ghanima. The children with Chani in that last shot where she drops her blue scarf in the desert can only be Leto and Ghanima. Leto and Ghanima are Paul Atreides' twin children, whom he very clearly sires on his lover rather than with his wife. But there's a problem with this shot because, canonically speaking, it shouldn't exist. That's because Paul never foresaw Leto's birth. We'll get to more on that in just a few moments, but Leto shouldn't be there, and Chani playing with both him and Ghanima is clearly something that's a result of a different life decision, because in the books, she doesn't even get to hold them. So, the blue scarf timeline and the real timeline could have some amount of overlap, but it's also possible that they remain separate because Denis Villeneuve has framed his take on Dune as being Paul's story. Frank Herbert's Dune went beyond Paul the moment he conceived Leto, and Dune 3 has cast teenage versions of both Leto and Ghanima. Maybe Denis has found a way to wrap up the entire Atreides storyline through a series of flash-forwards, because we know Dune fans, and if you give them a whiff of the Worm God Emperor, they'll never let it go. Maybe Denis does have a Shadow 4th film planned, which is why he's included Leto and Ghanima at 2 different ages, but there is a way that he could prevent the story from going in that direction entirely and contain it within his trilogy, and that is by making the Blue Scarf timeline the alternate reality that could have happened. This is just a theory though, so let us know what you guys think in the comments down below. The consequences of the jihad. Moving on from speculation, one thing that cannot be called into question is the dreadful impact of Paul's holy war. The Dune films have made a point of not calling his holy war a jihad, considering the real-world implications such usage would have, but if we do call it that, just know that it comes from a place of being authentic to the source material. Getting to the point though, it's true that one of the heaviest themes of Dune 3 will be the casualties caused by Paul's prescient powers. We see his jihad at different stages in the trailer, in a bit of a beginning, middle, and end format. All the industrious shots of massive war machines firing lasers at each other come from the first few years of the jihad. Then, when the scene shifts to the main timeline, we hear Jason Momoa saying Paul has killed thousands, and we see a muddy field choked with corpses. Then, we see a shot of Alia standing in the sands with dozens, scores, if not hundreds of crucified bodies baking in the sun. This represents the 3 stages of Muad'Dib's universal conquest. The initial wave feels heroic, then you see the actual number of casualties, and by the end, death itself has become part of his religion. Alia standing among those corpses is a cold message of domination. She's daring anyone within the Imperium to sully the sands watered with the blood of their followers and enemies. For Paul, this is the culmination of his first proper prescient vision. We don't see soldiers praying at Duke Leto's enshrined skull, but we get the next closest thing. The reminder that his war has a cost beyond lives is something Dune 3 will be giving us at each and every turn, especially through its surprise return character. Paul interrogates and spars with Hayt. Jason Momoa has returned to the Dune franchise, but he isn't Duncan Idaho anymore. Not really. Momoa's character is now called Hayt, and his creepy white eyes are the mark of his unnatural creation. You see, he's a Gola now, a genetically modified biological entity created by the Tleilaxu. At one point in the trailer, Scytale tells someone he's found something that could destabilize Paul's regime from within, and our guess is he's talking about Duncan Idaho's DNA. The process of creating a Tleilaxu Gola involves harvesting the DNA of the person intended to be cloned, and clearly, they were successful in doing that with Duncan Idaho. The reason they choose him is because he's Paul's oldest friend and mentor, and more importantly, he's an Atreides man to the core. At one point in the trailer, Hayt expresses his views on honor, and Paul even says that he sounds like an Atreides. Hayt simply replies that he's been told he used to be one. Golas don't typically retain their memories, but just the sight of this man, who proclaimed Paul his duke and died protecting him, is going to be enough to make Paul waver, because Duncan is a reminder of what the Atreides banner used to stand for. In the trailer, we see Paul interrogating him about his view on all the things Muad'Dib has done during his reign. Hayt calls it unconscionable and calls Paul a monster. Then they have a sparring match which becomes a staple of their daily routine in the books. Paul defeats Hayt in the trailer, but he also doesn't appear to be happy about his victory, because this is clearly not the Duncan he grew up training under. Paul's interactions with Hayt will force his deepest regrets to the surface, because the thing is, he thinks of himself the way Hayt thinks of him. Paul is his own silent critic, and Hayt will become a reflection of the same. That's why when he declares his intended purpose to Paul, he questions why he should hinder it. Hayt's peace proposal. Hayt says that he came to Arrakis as a peace offering from the Tleilaxu. Now, Paul already knows that the Tleilaxu don't exactly worship him, and they'll be seeking to replace him however they can. At the beginning of Dune 3, Paul will have made every single noble family and great guild within the Imperium dependent upon him because he now controls the supply of spice. That's a substance that every civilization in the Duneverse depends upon, including the Tleilaxu, and Paul knows this. The thing about Paul's prescience is that many times he's aware of the plots against him, but he lets them play out anyways because he knows that an opportune moment will present itself to him. So when Hayt says he comes as a peace offering and says that Paul will reject him, Paul questions him why he should refuse a good thing such as peace. Hayt simply replies that he'll reject it because it's meant to destroy him, because he might be a clone, but he knows how prescience works just fine. It's this piece that ends up sealing Paul's fate, and the trailer actually expands upon the conspiracy against him quite elaborately. But first, let's close out this Duncan, Idaho loop by addressing the biggest mystery from the trailer. What's in that red box? As soon as Duncan says that the piece is meant to destroy Paul, we see the scene shift to a cave where Duncan stands beside a brightly glowing red box. Paul is dressed in robes and he takes out 2 Christ knives from their sheaths. Then the scene shifts again, but we're still left wondering what's inside that box. Well, we have an idea of what it could be, but that in itself is a contradiction. The only time Paul and Hayt are alone in a cave with one another in the books is when Paul goes to check on Chani during her labor. Sadly, she dies, but Paul learns that he has not 1, but 2 children by her. Hayt is acting as his protector at this point in the story, so it makes sense that he's with Paul, but the way he presents the kids to him is what strikes us as odd. Why would Hayt be the one presenting Paul's kids to him and not Chani? Well, the answer to that is that Chani dies during childbirth in the books, and her children's lives are immediately put at the mercy of the Tleilaxu. We'll get to what we mean by that in a few moments, but that's what we think is in the box. It's baby Leto and Ghanima, and Paul is pulling his knives out because a good father doesn't bring lethal weapons into the presence of his children. Or it could be some other film-exclusive gift the Tleilaxu have whipped up for him, which there's a real possibility that's true. The whole objective of the Paul in the cave sequence from the books was to separate him from his seat of power long enough to strike a bargain with him at his most vulnerable, and that undercurrent is present throughout every scene featuring Hayt and the other Tleilaxus. We'll get to that in a moment, but before it, we need to talk about Paul's official wife. Irulan's secret Bene Gesserit training. The first time we see Irulan in the trailer, she's wearing her all-white robes in queenly fashion and walking all over Paul's imperial residence. We see several characters dressed in similar sand and burgundy robes all around her, and these are most likely members of the Kizarate, the followers of Paul's personal religion, the Church of the Golden Elixir. Them bowing their heads to Irulan, recognizing her authority as queen, already suggests that there's some sort of split between Paul's original Fremen power base. Some would adapt to imperial life, and some naturally wouldn't, and it looks like the Kizarate is part of the former. But the fact that they show up in Irulan's scenes more than Paul's is also suggestive of their allegiances, because in the book, the highest members of Paul's church join in a conspiracy against him. The fact that the trailer only highlights them during Irulan's appearances could be an allusion to the same, and Irulan herself is quite suspect. In the trailer, we see her 3 distinct times. The first we've already mentioned, the third we'll talk about in a few moments, and the second is when she's surrounded by Bene Gesserit sisters but looking quite scaly. In this particular shot, Florence Pugh's face looks a lot like that of a newborn, covered in skin as though she's just been given some sort of procedure. That makes sense because Irulan in the film will be doing what the Tleilaxu are trying to do, and that is end the threat that is Paul Atreides. People might have forgotten this, but Irulan was personally trained by Gaius Helen Mohiam herself. Being trained by the Mother Superior of the Bene Gesserit isn't just a high honor, it's usually a statement. Most leaders pick their understudies with a view to shape them for command, and Irulan has something that no one else in the Sisterhood has: proximity to Paul. If anyone can get close enough to do some damage or sabotage his plans, it's Irulan, and you best believe that she isn't going to just sit there and allow House Corrino's downfall to be completed without a single revolt. As to what her secret Bene Gesserit training is going to result in, that remains to be seen. There's also the distinct possibility that it isn't Irulan, but a face dancer like Scytale or Sister Theodosia from Dune Prophecy. Face dancers are specifically trained as assassins, so if one of them replaces Irulan at any point in the film, then it will be for the express purpose of killing Paul. But even if that doesn't happen, the Sisterhood has secrets of its own, hidden ways that they may teach to Irulan to strengthen her gifts, like her mastery of the voice, for instance. The Sisterhood also has vast knowledge of various kinds of medicine and drugs, which could prove invaluable for Irulan's purpose. All this to say that Irulan is going to level up in a major way, and you're going to need to keep an eye on her in Dune 3. Why does Irulan say Scytale has doomed them? This query comes from perhaps the most iconic scene in Dune Messiah, the meeting where the conspirators hatch their plan to depose Paul. In Dune Messiah, the Sisterhood, the Tleilaxu, and the Spacing Guild all send representatives to a guild highliner where Princess Irulan arrives to listen to their plans for dealing with Paul. The trailer does feature a smaller ship entering a highliner, and Irulan steps out of what appears to be a spacecraft. In the books, Irulan is a ringleader, but in the films, it looks like she might be a follower instead. We say that because when she's surrounded by her fellow co-conspirators, one of them, Scytale, openly says that he seeks regime change on Arrakis. Irulan freaks out and says that he's already doomed them, and Scytale appears worried. That's because a secret conspiracy requires a secret meeting place and codes to keep the conspirators' words hidden from those they're conspiring against. It looks as though Paul's power has grown so much that he can use his prescience to sniff out resistance against him all across the galaxy, and Irulan, being his wife, must have seen this firsthand. That's why when Scytale openly talks about deposing Paul, she becomes incredibly tense because he's basically sent a flare through the prescient landscape. But what she doesn't know is that Scytale is well aware of this, and he's literally walking around with a counter to Paul's powers, which brings us to his plan. Scytale's plan. Scytale actually makes quite a few appearances throughout the trailer, but we can break them down into 3 parts. We've already spoken about one appearance. The second is when he rocks up in a white robe to what looks like a Bene Gesserit mother house with a Spacing Guild member floating beside him. For his third appearance, he's in full Fremen gear, and he crash lands on the sands of Arrakis. In fact, it's possible that the ornithopter we see being attacked in the trailer is the one with Scytale on board. But what do these appearances tell us about his role? Well, quite a lot, actually. Scytale's appearance at the Mother House with a Spacing Guild member suggests that they brought this plot to the Sisterhood, who then brought in Irulan to execute. The Guild member themselves is an answer to Irulan's panic about being seen by Paul's prescience, because in this universe, prescience has a bit of a pattern. Paul isn't the only prescient being, though he is the most powerful. The Spacing Guild's navigators are also prescient, they just use their power to navigate the vast distances of space. However, their prescience allows them to block the vision of another prescient being, and this is something Scytale knows. That's how he cloaks the conspirators' meeting, and the reason he's on Arrakis in the first place is probably as part of Hayt's delivery process. Scytale himself being on Arrakis is a massive problem because he, like Theodosia, is a face dancer. He could easily kill anybody and assume their identity, and we suspect that's why they're on Dune in the first place. Hayt is just a distraction, and Scytale is the true weapon, and we can't wait to see how Robert Pattinson portrays the duality of his character's nature on screen. The Statue of Muad'Dib. This is one of many instances where Villeneuve seems to be taking poetic license, because at around the halfway point of the trailer, we see a spacecraft flying into Arrakeen, and it passes by a statue that's clearly meant to depict Paul. In the books, this massive statue becomes a point of propaganda because it wasn't established by Paul himself as much as it was by his sister, Alia. Alia's presence in Dune 3 is going to be rather interesting because she's vulnerable in a way that she can't even defend herself against. But the point we're trying to make here is that she commissions and oversees the construction of a massive monument to commemorate her brother as a divine ruler, because that image of Paul is what keeps the Atreides Empire together. Seeing it appear in the trailer during what feels like it's still Paul's era is rather telling, because it suggests that he's embraced the trappings of power a lot more openly than his book counterpart. Of course, that shot could also be from the end of the film, and we'll address why that could be the case in a few moments, but there's some other stuff we gotta get through first. Chani's resistance. In the final third, the trailer really picks up on the foreshadowing for the series' end, and one of the biggest examples of that is this. Throughout the trailer, we see these shots of hooded figures, presumably Fremen, moving through the cave systems of Arrakis, seemingly working against Muad'Dib. Then, there's a shot of Paul entering a room with his shaved head, and there's Chani. sitting on the floor and asking him how it feels to know that he's human after all. We also see Chani geared up for war on at least 3 other occasions in this trailer, one of which we need to talk about, but the gist of it is this. At some point, Chani becomes one of the Fremen who's resisting Paul's rule, and this resistance turns violent over time. The fact that she confronts Paul with his mortality alone is proof to us that there will be some sort of timeline chicanery going on in this film, because otherwise, Villeneuve has given himself the task of reconciling 2 sides of Chani that are completely at odds with each other. The Stone Burner and Paul's vision malfunction. Sticking with the theme of resistance and rebellion, there is a specific event which marks the beginning of Paul's downfall in the books, and it will definitely happen in the movie, considering they've already released posters depicting its effects on him. A stone burner is a compact nuclear device that, when detonated, can blind anyone who looks upon it. To make a long story short, Paul will look upon it, and this will play into his vision's malfunction plotline from the film. As Paul continues to doubt his actions, his visions become a lot less clear until he reaches a point where he can't see beyond a fixed path. We've already mentioned the fact that he didn't anticipate Leto's birth in the books and that he perceived it as a major sign of there being something wrong with him. But in the trailer, he also claims to no longer be able to see, and he doesn't even have the burn marks that signify his blindness. In Fremen culture, blind folks enter the desert and are martyred by Shai-Hulud, but Paul can't afford to do that as emperor, right? He can still continue to function normally by guiding himself through his visions, but this choice will continue to affect his standing among his own people. This tension between tradition and Paul's new order will become the core of the Fremen resistance as well, and it's nice to see that we'll be getting both perspectives on it, theirs and his. But speaking of tradition, a green paradise. There's a moment in the trailer where Stilgar stands on a beach with a bunch of Fremen warriors, looking dumbstruck because it's the most amount of flowing water any of them have ever seen. This is the same beach where Alia appeared to Paul in his Dune 2 visions, and the beach itself is the first step he takes in fulfilling his promise to the Fremen. When Paul took control, he promised them that he'd turn Arrakis into a green paradise, and introducing large bodies of water is the first step. We know that Liet Kynes was researching terraforming technology before her death, and Paul's seen it firsthand. Perhaps he begins the process of terraforming the planet by the time Dune 3's main timeline picks up, which would also explain why his reforms don't deter many Fremen from being loyal to him. It's true that Arrakis is eventually transformed into a green planet, but Paul isn't the person to do it, and the terraforming itself requires Ixian tech that borderline flaunts the tenets of the Butlerian jihad. Perhaps Paul has struck a deal with the Ixians in the film. Dune Prophecy highlighted them for a reason, and it could be to demonstrate their shadowy influence in Dune Part 3. But the overall impact of terraforming is that Paul will now forever be remembered as the being who gave the Fremen their heart's deepest desire and changed the deserts of Arrakis into a green paradise. Who did Alia kill? Who is that Bene Gesserit? As for Paul's sister, she's going to have a tough time because, as many of you might know, Alia's a bit of a loose cannon. She's an abomination, a preborn child who was prescient and telepathic within the womb. She has the ancestral memories of both sides of her lineage, and because she's had those memories since the moment she became conscious, she's always struggling to rein them in. We saw how dangerous ancestral possession can be with Lila from Dune Prophecy. Alia's lineage is even worse because her ancestors are both Atreides and Harkonnens, and Baron Vladimir Harkonnen's consciousness is part of hers as well. How will this influence her actions in the film? Well, it might make her a lot more violent than you'd expect, because there's a shot in this trailer that makes Alia seem terrifying. She's wearing a white dress, but she's covered in red blood, and Anya Taylor-Joy is screaming at a Bene Gesserit sister that Alia's seemingly visiting. Whose blood is that? Well, it could be the traitors and rebels' blood, because after Paul, Alia is the second most powerful person in the Atreides Empire. In fact, she directly leads the investigation into plots against her brother in the books, so that tracks. As for who the Bene Gesserit is, in our minds, it can only be one of 2 people. It's either Irulan or Gaius Helen Mohiam, and our money's on Mohiam because Alia hates her, especially in the books. But then again, it could be Alia's own blood on her robes, so your guess is as good as ours, but Irulan does seem less likely considering how her story ends. And this isn't the only inexplicable part of the trailer. Hayt's test of loyalty. At one point, Paul drops Hayt onto a battlefield and seemingly fights alongside him. He's got post-Stoneburner eyes, so it looks like this is when the Fremen rebellion reaches its peak against him. Here, we see Hayt doing the Atreides salute, and that's interesting because technically he shouldn't be anything like Duncan Idaho. However, his baseline personality, ideology, skill set, well, those are all Duncan's, and this is the biggest sign of that. As for who he's fighting, that's where things become interesting because this could be a trust-building exercise. Paul could be testing Hayt's loyalty to him because clearly Hayt's a killer on the battlefield. Whether that delights Paul or disquiets him, or does a bit of both, we'll have to wait and see, but it is clear that he'll be keeping this deceptive gift quite close to himself throughout Dune 3. How a guild highliner works. This is a bit of a geek moment because one thing we fully expect to see is just how Villeneuve's guild navigators fly the highliners, and we think we've gotten a glimpse of that in the trailer. At one point, we see one of the Spacing Guild navigator tanks descending into a hole in an ornately carved metallic room. This could be the navigator entering the mechanism that attaches his pod to the Holtzman engine, and this will mark the first time we see something close to lore-accurate spaceflight in the franchise's adaptations, because what David Lynch interpreted spacefolding as in his adaptation can only be called an intergalactic laser show at best. The Golden Path. The most exciting moment for us was the glimpse of the Golden Path we got in the trailer, and we're sure it was the Golden Path because A, there was gold, and B, the gold formed a tunnel-like pathway. Now, yes, this is admittedly flimsy ground to stand upon, but here's the thing. The Golden Path is the guiding philosophy of the entire franchise, and Paul is the vessel through which its manifestation is intended. In fact, he knows much about what's going to happen to him because all his visions are pointing him towards this path, and every action he does or doesn't take is constructed around him fulfilling its objectives. The Golden Path is the reason Paul's reign becomes so complicated in its final years, and why he himself feels so conflicted, and it will be a privilege to see how this foundational concept in the Duneverse is handled, and more importantly, resolved by Villeneuve. Did Chani control a sandworm? Our final point in this video concerns the final sequence of shots from the trailer, because, correct us if we're wrong, but those shots seem to be implying that Chani can now stop a friggin' sandworm with her mere presence. Now, this isn't impossible. In the books, there are a couple of characters who can do so, but the fact that they can do that pretty much deifies them instantly. Chani is a rebel in Dune 3, so the fact that Shai-Hulud chooses to bend its neck to her will be seen as an even bigger sign of her being the true inheritor of the Fremen spirit, not Paul. The last shot of the trailer shows Paul begging for forgiveness for everything that he's done, and while that's something he should be saying to Chani, we don't think he's talking to her. He's probably talking to himself, but let's not get sidetracked. In the books, Chani goes on a Fremen fertility diet, which involves large amounts of spice, so if she goes through something similar in the movies, it is possible she gains a different power set from Paul. There's another possibility that explains this unusual event, and that is, maybe Chani is pregnant when it happens. Because if that is the case, then one of only 2 people who can instinctively command sandworms is growing within her. So the answers vary based on the direction Villeneuve takes her in, because everything about Chani is different from the books. But if she can in fact stop a sandworm by herself, then that changes everything. And we can't wait to see what this particular shot is all about. Well, thanks for sticking with us to the end of this one, and we hope you enjoyed our breakdown of these 20 hidden details within the Dune Part 3 trailer. Let us know your thoughts on the ending of the defining sci-fi trilogy of this decade down in the comments down below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more Dune content, because there's a lot of it coming your way. We'll see you guys soon with yet another video, but until then, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time.